Ever feel like you're waiting and waiting on God, and his promise, and you just get tired of waiting and kind of want to make things happen yourself?
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's what we're diving into today.
For sure.
Genesis chapter 16.
It's a good one.
We see this play out in a really powerful way. Welcome to the Make Heaven Crowded podcast.
Yeah, welcome, everybody.
We're going to unpack this story about impatience and divine intervention.
Absolutely.
And even prophecy that we see all the way through history to today.
Yeah, what's really cool about this chapter is that it kind of shows this struggle that we all experience, right? Trusting God's timing versus taking matters into our own hands and, those consequences.
Yeah, they're far-reaching.
It's huge, yeah.
So let's dive right in verse 1. Genesis 16 introduces us to Sarai, Abram's wife,
right,
who is unable to bear children.
Right.
Now, just imagine in ancient culture how significant
huge deal,
that would have been.
Yeah, you have to understand that, a woman's worth was often linked to her ability to have children. But here's the thing.
Right.
God had already promised Abram a son back in chapter 15.
Right.
So right away you see this tension between God's promise and then Sarai's very human struggle with infertility.
Yeah, and then in comes Hagar, Sarai's Egyptian maidservant.
Right.
And it specifically points that out, that she's Egyptian.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious why that's important.
Yeah, it's not just a random detail.
Right.
Egypt often represents, throughout the Bible, a reliance on worldly power, human effort rather than faith in God. So it's like Sarai's looking for a human solution instead of trusting in that divine promise.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
So verse 2, Sarai comes up with a plan, suggests that Abram have a child with Hagar.
Right.
Now, this was a common practice back then.
Yes, very common.
It was even outlined in Hammurabi's code, right?
Yeah, it was a legal practice, a form of surrogacy. Even though it was culturally acceptable, it still reflects a lack of faith in God's promise.
Yeah. She basically acknowledges that God has prevented her from conceiving.
Yeah.
But then tries to manipulate the situation instead of waiting on his timing.
And this is something we can all relate to,
Totally.
Think about a time when you felt impatient.
Oh, yeah.
When you try to force something to happen rather than surrendering to God's plan.
For sure.
I mean, Genesis 16 is like a mirror to that very human struggle.
Moving on to verse 3, we see Sarai giving Hagar to Abram to be his wife.
Right.
This gets a little tricky, doesn't it? Because polygamy wasn't part of God's original design for marriage.
Absolutely. And the Bible doesn't shy away from presenting the complexities of this. It's recording the events, not necessarily endorsing them, but it shows that ripple effect of impatience, deviating from God's ideal and creating a whole mess of relational problems.
And that mess unfolds quickly.
Yeah.
Verse 4 tells us that Hagar becomes pregnant and then starts to look down on Sarai.
Ooh. Yeah, classic human nature, right?
Oh, yeah.
Hagar's newfound status goes to her head. The power dynamic shifts, breeds resentment and conflict. Ultimately, Hagar flees into the wilderness to escape Sarai's harsh treatment.
And now we're at verses 5 and 6, and it's pure drama.
Oh, yeah.
Sarai blames Abram for the whole situation.
Right.
Even though it was her idea in the first place.
Right.
And Abram just kind of washes his hands against it, deal with it however you see fit.
So this is where you see the consequences of their actions taking root.
Right.
Sin has a way of snowballing, impacting not just the individuals involved, but fracturing those relationships.
Right.
Abram's passivity, doesn't absolve him of responsibility.
Right.
And Sarai's anger and mistreatment of Hagar reveal how far they've strayed from God's path.
And this brings us to a turning point in the chapter of 7. Alone and pregnant Hagar encounters the angel of the Lord at a spring in the wilderness.
Big moment.
How significant is this?
This is huge. This is the first recorded theophany, a visible appearance of God in the Bible.
Wow.
Many scholars believe this is actually a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus.
Wow.
The angel speaks with divine authority and makes promises only God can fulfill.
The way the angel interacts with Hagar is interesting.
Yeah.
He doesn't just appear and start giving orders.
Right.
Verse 8, he asks her, "Where have you come from and where are you going?"
It's a brilliant question. It's not that God needs information.
Right.
He already knows everything.
He knows it all.
It's about prompting reflection, helping Hagar understand her situation and recognize God is present even in her distress. It's a reminder God sees us even when we feel lost and alone.
And then comes the command.
Okay.
Verse 9, the angel tells Hagar to return to Sarai and submit to her. Now, this might seem unfair considering how Sarai treated her.
Yeah.
What are we to make of this instruction?
Well, it's not about condoning Sarai's actions.
Right.
It's about God working through a messy situation for a greater purpose. Obedience, even in difficult circumstances, is key in the Bible. God's command to Hagar highlights his sovereignty and his ability to use even our mistakes to achieve his will.
And we get a glimpse of that will in verses 10 through 12.
Yes.
The angel gives Hagar an incredible prophecy about her unborn son, Ishmael.
Yeah, this is where things get incredibly interesting.
Okay.
The angel tells Hagar that her son will be a wild man. His descendants will be too numerous to count, and they will be in conflict with everyone around them. It's a prophecy with profound implications for history, setting the stage for this Arab-Israeli tension we see even today.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing to think that a prophecy made thousands of years ago
I know.
is still playing out on the world stage.
It's crazy.
In verse 13, we see Hagar's powerful response to God's intervention.
Yeah.
She says, "You are the God who sees me."
Another pivotal moment, Hagar gives God a name, El Roi, which means the God who sees.
Wow.
It's an acknowledgement of God's personal involvement in her life, his compassion for the outcast, and his ability to see and care for even those who feel invisible to the world.
It's a beautiful reminder for all of us.
Absolutely.
That no matter what we're going through,
yeah,
God sees us. He knows our pain, our struggles, and our hopes. He is present even in the darkest of times.
Exactly. And that's a truth often overlooked or even denied in today's world. Critics often portray God as distant and uncaring. But Genesis 16 paints a very different picture.
For sure. So we see God's compassion and intervention in Hagar's life, even when she was running away from a difficult situation.
Right.
It makes you wonder, what can we learn from her experience?
Yeah. Hagar's story is a powerful reminder that God sees us, especially when we feel alone and forgotten.
Right.
But it also highlights those consequences of human choices, even those made with good intentions.
That's right. And picking up with verses 15 and 16, we see Hagar giving birth to Ishmael.
Right.
And Abram being 86 years old at this point.
Yeah.
It's a detail that seems almost insignificant, but I bet it's there for a reason.
Oh, yeah. It's crucial. Remember, God had promised Abram a son.
Right.
But it will still be another 13 years before Isaac is born.
Right.
The son specifically promised to Abram and Sarai. This constant reminder throughout the story emphasizes that God's timing is not our timing. His plans often unfold in ways we can't predict or control.
Oh, it's such a good reality check for those of us who get impatient waiting on God.
Oh, yeah.
So looking back at these first 16 verses, what are some of the key takeaways?
I think this chapter is packed with insights into human nature, God's character, and the consequences of our choices. We see the danger of impatience, the temptation to force God's hand, and the ripple effects of sin on our relationships.
Yeah.
But we also see God's incredible compassion for the outcast, his faithfulness to his promises, and his ability to work through even our messiest situations to bring about his purposes.
So even when we make mistakes, even when we take matters into our own hands and things get complicated, we can still trust that God is working behind the scenes.
Exactly. That's the beauty of God's grace. He doesn't abandon us when we mess up.
Right.
He can redeem our mistakes and use them for his glory.
Powerful message of hope.
For sure.
But this chapter isn't just about a historical event, right?
Right.
It seems to foreshadow a much bigger story.
You're hitting on something really important.
Yeah.
Many scholars see the angel of the Lord as a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus.
Wow.
Hagar's encounter with him, her recognition of him as the God who sees, points forward to Jesus' own ministry of compassion for the outcast and marginalized.
Wow, it's like we're seeing a mini version of the gospel story playing out.
Yeah.
Right here in Genesis 16.
Exactly. God intervening in a messy situation. offering grace and hope to those who feel lost and alone.
Right.
And setting in motion a plan that ultimately leads to redemption.
Precisely. And that's the beauty of studying the Bible.
Yeah.
We see these themes and connections woven throughout the entire narrative.
Absolutely. Genesis 16 is just one small but significant thread in this grand tapestry of God's love and faithfulness.
Okay, so before we wrap up, let's zoom out a bit and talk about the bigger picture.
Okay.
What are some practical takeaways from Genesis 16 that we can apply to our lives today?
I think the most important takeaway is the call to trust God's timing. You know, we live in a culture of instant gratification, wanting everything right now. But God often works on a different timeline, and his delays are not denials. They're often opportunities for us to grow in faith and learn to depend on him more fully.
It's so easy to get discouraged when we don't see things happening on our schedule.
Yeah.
But Genesis 16 reminds us that God is faithful to his promises, even if it takes longer than we expect.
Absolutely. Another important takeaway is the importance of recognizing God's presence in our lives. Even in the midst of difficult circumstances, you know, Hagar's encounter with the angel of the Lord reminds us that God is not some distant, uncaring being. He sees our pain, he hears our cries, and is always there to comfort and guide us.
That image of the God who sees is so powerful.
It is.
It's a beautiful reminder that we're never truly alone, even when we feel isolated or forgotten.
And lastly, Genesis 16 challenges us to consider the long-term consequences of our choices. Sarai and Abram's decision to take matters into their own hands had ripple effects that lasted for generations.
Wow.
It's a sobering reminder that our actions have consequences, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. So before we make a major decision, especially when we feel impatient or tempted to go outside of God's will, it's crucial to ask ourselves, what are the potential consequences of this choice? Could it lead me or others further away from God's path?
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
We need to think about not just the immediate outcomes of our choices, but also the long-term impact they might have on ourselves and those around us. It reminds me of the butterfly effect. One small action can set off a chain reaction with far-reaching consequences.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to ground our decisions in prayer. Seeking God's guidance and wisdom. His perspective is eternal, while ours is limited. When we submit our plans to him, we can trust that he'll lead us in the right direction, even if it doesn't always make sense in the moment.
Yeah, it's amazing how a story from thousands of years ago can speak so directly to our lives today.
I know, it's incredible.
Yeah, it's a reminder that the human heart hasn't really changed all that much, and neither has God's faithfulness.
That's the beauty of the Bible. You know, it's not just a collection of ancient stories. It's a living, breathing word that speaks to the deepest longings and struggles of the human heart, regardless of time period. So
true. And speaking of struggles, one thing that often comes up when discussing this passage is the issue of slavery.
Yeah.
Some people point to Hagar's status as a maidservant and say that the Bible condones slavery. How do we address that?
Yeah, that's an important question, and it's crucial to face it head on. The Bible is a product of its time, and reflects the cultural norms of the ancient world, including the practice of slavery. However, that doesn't mean that the Bible endorses slavery as a good or godly institution.
It seems like the Bible often highlights the injustice and suffering caused by slavery.
Absolutely.
Yeah, like the Exodus story.
Yes, great example.
It's all about God delivering his people from slavery in Egypt.
Exactly.
And ultimately, Jesus came to set us free from the ultimate slavery. Sin and death.
That's right.
So while we need to acknowledge the historical context of slavery in the Bible, we can't impose modern-day values onto ancient texts.
It's about the overall message.
What's important is the overall message.
Exactly. The Bible's message is one of redemption and hope, even in the midst of brokenness and injustice. And that message is woven throughout the entire narrative, even in stories like Hagar's. It's a reminder that God is always working to bring about good, even in the midst of difficult and often unfair circumstances.
And speaking of redemption, this chapter also foreshadows a bigger story, God's plan to redeem all of humanity through Jesus Christ.
That's right. As we discussed earlier, many scholars believe the angel of the Lord was a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus and Hagar's encounter with him. Her recognition of him as the God who sees points forward to Jesus's compassion for those who are marginalized and overlooked by society.
It's like we're seeing a preview of the gospel story playing out right here.
Exactly.
In Genesis 16, God intervening in a messy situation, offering grace and hope, and setting in motion a plan that ultimately leads to redemption.
That's right. For all who believe.
For all who believe, exactly. And that's the beauty of studying the Bible.
Yeah.
We see these themes and connections woven throughout the entire narrative.
I love that.
Genesis 16, just one small but significant piece in the grand tapestry of God's love and faithfulness.
Beautiful.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Genesis 16, what's one final thought you'd like to leave our listeners with?
Just remember, God sees you. He knows your struggles, hopes, fears. And even when you can't see it, he is working to bring about his good purposes in your life.
That is such an encouraging thought. No matter what you're going through, you're not alone.
That's right.
The God who saw Hagar in her distress sees you too, and he is with you every step of the way. Well, that was an incredible deep dive into Genesis 16.
It was good.
It's a story packed with drama, intrigue, and profound theological truths. Don't forget to check out our YouTube channel, Make Heaven Crowded, where we have a fully visualized version of Genesis 16, bringing this ancient story to life. And as always, we love hearing from you. Share this deep dive with someone who needs to hear it, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. What stood out to you in this story? Until next time, keep seeking God, keep making heaven crowded, and keep diving deep into his word.